My name is Joshua Landis. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Rami Khouri, who is a senior policy fellow at AUB, the Issam Ferris Center at the American University in Beirut. He's also a lifelong journalist and a citizen of the world. He's a Palestinian from Nazareth, a citizen of Jordan and the United States. He has also been with us now for 3 weeks as a visiting practitioner in residence, our first Sam Hamra resident fellow. So it's a pleasure to speak today with Rami Khouri. Rami Khouri, welcome to University of Oklahoma and the Center for Middle East Studies. We are very lucky here to have Rami Khouri as our inaugural scholar in residence for the new practitioner role for 3 weeks here at the University of Oklahoma, and we've been having a great time. Welcome to University of Oklahoma.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm learning all the time, and it's a great thrill.
Great. Now, you've been giving a series of lectures. Is the Middle East, the Arab Spring, is it a rebirth of the Arab world, or is it in some ways the death of an Arab world?
The irony of the situation now, in some retrospect, because the Arab uprisings of the Arab Spring has been going on for almost 4 years, be 4 years at middle of December. And the irony now we can see more clearly in retrospect with all of the turmoil that's happened in the last 3 years. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, fighting, sectarian, killing people, killing each other. And at the same time, there's still people pushing on, trying to write their constitutions. I mean, even in Yemen and Libya, with the fighting and the sectarianism and the tribal violence, there's people sitting down, working on constitutional transition, trying to keep it going. Egypt has kind of taken a few years off under military rule again, but there are going to be pushes in Egypt. Tunisia is the only one that's really broken through to an implementation now of a new constitution. This is all going on while you have countries collapsing. Syria, Iraq are the worst cases. Lebanon is turbulent as always. It's not going to collapse, but there's stuff at the fringes happening, which is dangerous. Yemen, we don't know what's going to happen in Yemen. It could split up. Iraq could split up. Syria could split up. Libya could split up. Or we don't know what's going to happen. It's completely up in the air. So what I think is going on is simultaneously the death of the three orders that shaped the Arab world, you know, the post-World War I state, the post-World War II national developmental state with the Cold War holding it together, and then the post-1970 Arab security state fueled by oil and run by family dictatorships that took power in the 70s and ruled for 30, 40 years nonstop, and some of them are still in power. Those three orders have all failed in one way or another. They each achieved something. They built schools, they built roads, they created health centers here and there. They did some stuff, but in the end they all failed the test of statehood, which is legitimacy, service delivery, citizenship, and a certain decency in the public order. And all of these have failed. So the old orders are dying. The three old orders they're not dying completely, but they're frayed at the edges, and some of them are dying completely. They were challenged in the Arab uprisings in a serious way, especially the modern Arab security state, which is the one that has ruled for 30, 40 years now, since the early 70s. That's the major challenge, citizens trying to get rid of the Arab security state and instead have some kind of pluralistic democratic system. But the other two orders also are being challenged because they haven't worked. And there's at the same time a birth of, or an attempted birth, of a new order, which will be different in every country, but a new order in which citizens write their own constitutions, shape their governance systems, articulate their national values, and decide on really big sticker issues like religiosity, secularism, role of women, role of minorities, role of Arabism, role of Islam, relations with Zionism, relations with Arabism, relations with the West, relations with Russia, relations with Iran. All of these big sticker items are ones that countries deal with when they are shaping their constitutions. And normally, in, say, the American or the French or the European experience, countries will create a constitution. They'll usually make it a mess of it in the beginning, and then a few years later they'll revise it, then they'll make amendments, and over 10, 20 years they'll come up with a constitution, and then over the next 2 centuries, for 200 years, they'll keep revising it and debating it, and that's what real democracies do. The Arabs are in the first years of this process. So I think we can talk about the death of an old order and the early birth pangs of a new order.
Now, why did the old order fail so miserably? What led to its inability to provide proper governance and to get growth numbers up? And why has it left the Middle East in such a bad shape?
You know, I think if you, again, look in retrospect, which we can now, it's 100 years since World War I now. We have a century of this.
Sure.
And then we have the 4 years of the uprisings, and there's many other eras we can look at. I think there's 3 or 4 broad reasons why, and what's fascinating in the Arab world, it's the only part of the world where the entire region, every Arab country without exception, failed to make a transition to a credible democracy. You had little instances of liberalism and stuff, but there was no real credible democracy in any Arab country. It's the only region that collectively remained non-democratic. Africa, South America, East Europe, Asia, they all in various ways became democratic here and there. But we were, as a bloc, non-democratic, and that tells you something. So I think there are some common characteristics. One of them is the curse of military rule. If you ask me what's the single biggest problem, it's countries run by security systems, often controlled by families. Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, people know these names more than they know countries. Ali Abdullah Saleh, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, Hosni Mubarak, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. You rattle these things off because these guys have more legitimacy, the names, the persons, the families, than maybe the entire country does. And that's the single biggest constraint. The second one is that you never had truly sustainable or equitable economic and social development that allowed, like you had, for instance, in autocratic South Korea or Taiwan or Malaysia or Indonesia. They had autocratic governments, but they had equitable and sustainable growth, which ultimately pushed them to liberalize and democratize. And the third reason is the combination of the Arab-Israeli conflict and its impact, which is unique to this region, and the incessant and continuing foreign intervention, military interventions, now symbolized worse than ever by American drones. So, you know, the American, and of course the American army is fighting, and other armies are fighting too, but the drones are the worst symbol because they can, you know, buzz around anywhere and zap people wherever they want, and there's no accountability, there's no rule of law, there's no...
Now, how central has the Arab-Israeli conflict been? Because a lot of people in Washington, particularly these days, are saying, really, the Arabs used Israel as the whipping boy because they couldn't agree on anything amongst themselves, so the Arab League and everybody else focused on the trauma of the Palestinians, but that's only because they refused to allow any of the cameras to focus on their own bad government and what they're doing to their own people. So how, you know, is there any justice to that argument, or is that really just an excuse on the part of Washington to try to keep the camera off of Israel?
I think it's somewhere in the middle. It's absolutely correct that Arab leaders, autocratic, non-elected, non-accountable leaders, families or individuals, Saddam Hussein, Hafiz al-Assad, did exactly that. They used the Palestine issue to rationalize their taking power in coups and running security states that focused on military power. And they said, this is how we protect our countries from Israel, we serve the Palestinians, and leaders did that. Now, populations of the Arab populations feel deeply about the Palestine issue. We know this from surveys now very, very clearly, and of course from just living in this area. Average citizens in most of the Arab countries, even far away in Morocco, they care deeply about Palestine because it's a colonial wound that remains hurtful to Arabs who have some kind of shared identity. But Arab people have never had a chance to really figure out, what do we do to help the Palestinians? What do we do to resist Zionism? Can we make peace with Israel? Can we make a just peace? Or do we just fight them? What do we do? So it's leaders who have exploited it, absolutely, but this is one of the reasons why I say the Arab-Israeli conflict is an issue, because, for instance, leaderships that spent 30% of their budgets on defense and security, because they claimed they needed it to fight Israel, of course none of them were able to fight Israel. Not a single one of them, except Hezbollah and Hamas put up a decent show in a certain area, but at a great cost. So the implications of the Arab-Israeli conflict for Arab countries in terms of wasted money on defense that never really defended the countries, and promoted corruption, promoted autocracy, and alienated citizens from their own governments, reduced the legitimacy of any of the rulers, and reduced and increased tensions. One of the reasons the Muslim Brotherhood group, for instance, grew quickly in the 70s and 80s from their smaller state before, was the resentment and the humiliation that millions of ordinary Arabs felt about being constantly beaten up by this small little Israeli state. And you know, these proud great Arabs with their armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, could do nothing. So there isn't a correlation. It's not the main reason, but it is a reason. But I would say that the Arab-Israeli conflict has been and remains the biggest source of radicalization and destabilization across the whole region, because the humiliation it caused, the distortions, the anger, the dehumanization that some people feel permeates populations and creates citizens who are dissatisfied and react somehow, and they tend to react by joining radical movements or losing faith in their own governments. So it is a real problem for the whole region. Resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict equitably for Israelis and Arabs both would be a huge benefit to being able to address some of the other issues in the region. They wouldn't solve them right away, but it would be a big benefit to get that issue out of the way.
So let me ask you, let's turn towards the promise. Where do you see the most promise in the new generation of campaigners, politicians, people out there struggling to improve their lives and to get a better state?
When you look at the whole of the Arab world, including the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of super qualified, very able, successful young middle-aged Arabs who are outside the Arab world, in banking and education, and here on your campus you have some incredibly talented Arab professors and graduate students and staff, and these people would not normally leave their countries to come to Oklahoma or to Chicago or to wherever they go. But you have hundreds of thousands of these people outside the Arab world. You have a new generation which has been expressing itself, I would say, for the last 10, 15 years with social media, with local community activism, younger Arabs who saw that their path to a normal life was blocked by the constraints of autocratic, corrupt regimes, incompetent Arab regimes, the Arab-Israeli conflict, foreign invaders and wars and tensions, increasing polarization in society, increasing pauperization, and so they decided they couldn't immigrate. They didn't want to join militant movements. They didn't want to just turn off and be, robots who just sat there and ate hummus and watched Jazeera. They wanted to live a normal life. These were 15, 20, 30-year-old people who had no jobs in most cases. Their education didn't qualify them to do anything. Even if they could get a government job, they would not do anything. So they started 10, 15 years ago, young people at the community level, at the national level, started doing different things. We documented this in a report that we did it was 2010, before the uprisings, that we published at my institute, the Essam Faris Institute at AUB. We did this report about youth in the Arab world with UNICEF, and it's on our website. If you go to the IFI website at AUB, it's fascinating because it shows you the mindset of young people in 2010. And of course, in December 2010, the whole thing exploded. So what they're doing, these younger people, in different ways, in business and volunteering and activism, is they're doing the single most important thing that you need for any change to happen. They're expressing themselves openly. They're not afraid to talk about their grievances, to talk about their rights. And this is what's important about this group of younger people now. But also they've been joined by middle-aged and others in the uprisings. They don't see themselves as people who have to beg their leadership to grant them a favor of increasing their salary or opening a clinic in their village. They have a right to those things. And this is the difference, that the mindset of a lot of people in the Arab world is that we are citizens, we have rights, and those rights should be granted to us, and if they're not given to us, we're going to work to achieve them. And after the first round of uprisings that overthrew Tunis and Egypt and other regimes, there was a great sense, a very important thing happened, that there was this great sense by ordinary citizens, well documented in polling by Gallup and others, a sense that not only do we have rights to a better world, but we have the capacity as citizens to act politically in our countries to make that better world happen. This is a mindset that never existed in the modern Arab world. People thought that either some foreign power was going to come and help you, or your great leader, the king or the ruler, the president, was going to be bountiful and generous and give you something, or nothing happened. Now that's changed. So I think that's where we are now. The uprisings have achieved a whole range of different results because they were mixed up with so many other things: sectarian tensions, foreign interventions, socioeconomic inequities, environmental stress, explicit manipulation by people like Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda to stoke anti-Shiite sentiment and to unleash this terrible genie of Shia-Sunni tensions, which never, tensions may have been there, but you never had outright violence. You never had people bombing each other's mosques, but that's now an element. Explicit sectarianism being promoted by rulers and others. All of these things have been happening on top of the underlying dynamic of the uprisings, which was disenchanted citizens who refused to acquiesce in their perpetual disenchantment. They refused to just accept what they had been given by previous failed generations, and they wanted to act to bring about something better. It's a human reaction. It's not a particularly Arab reaction or Islamic reaction. It's, you know, the Boston Tea Party and the Arab uprisings come from the same root. It's the sense of aggrieved citizens who are not treated justly, whether it's a foreign power or your own power or something, or a combination. In our case, it was our Arab autocrats plus foreign powers, whether it's Israeli occupation and colonization, or American attacks, or Russian intervention, or Iranian. It's not just Americans, it's all these foreigners, British and French before. And people refused to acquiesce in their own dehumanization. They put up with it for about 2 generations, from the 40s till the mid-80s, 90s, and then they started pushing back in different ways.
Now, the Islamism that has become such a powerful force in the Middle East, and which of course has spooked America and the West, and spooked many people in the Middle East too. What is the source of that? Is that because the oppression of these dictatorial regimes that have destroyed liberal oppositions, and the Islamists have been the only group powerful enough to survive this sort of desert of political life? Or is it because there is a popular mobilization in the Middle East, and the people are religious, and you get what you are, and that in a sense the Islamism is an expression of real democracy? What is the source of this, growing demand for Sharia law in Islamic countries?
I assume you're talking about the mainstream Islamists, Muslim Brothers,
Yes.
not these guys, not the radical jihad.
Not the radicals, but I guess I include the radical fringe in as well. As I guess that could be 2 different questions. I don't know. It's however you want to explain it.
Well, I think they're in fact, as I've been discussing with some of your colleagues, professors and students, which has been fascinating, to look at the transitions from the 60s to 70s and up till now, we have about 6 or 7 generations, maybe generations isn't the right word, we have 6 or 7 different manifestations of a fundamental underlying grievance that citizens have against their government or against foreign military threats. And of course the Afghanis had it with the Russians. So it wasn't just Americans or Israelis. Well, the Russians in Afghanistan, that's where bin Laden started, and Al-Qaeda started, the radical jihadi type militants started in fighting the Russians in Afghanistan, and then they came up in other forms. But we've had several manifestations. You had Muslim Brotherhood, mainstream Muslim Brothers. You had the Jama'ah Islamiyya, the militant killers who went around shooting people in Syria and Egypt and were whacked by those governments in the 70s and 80s. You had Hamas and Hezbollah. You had Al-Qaeda, you had Sufi groups, you had Salafist groups who were working at neighborhood level, and then they emerged, they got 20% of the votes in Egypt, and everybody was surprised. And now you have ISIS. So what you have is a recurring resurgence in new forms, in different places, due to different conditions, resurgence of new forms of the fundamentally same grievance, of aggrieved citizens who are not allowed to live a normal life. Now, the vast majority of aggrieved citizens in the Arab Islamic region would go join the Muslim Brotherhood or support the Muslim Brothers, nonviolent protest. They would support Hamas or Hezbollah, which are nationalist resistance movements fighting Israeli occupation, so there's a bit of a difference between them. But in the end, it was citizens who found no other outlet for their need to redress their grievance. There was no political mechanism, there was no legal mechanism, there was no mechanisms of accountability or participation that were allowed by the modern Arab security state that took hold in the 70s. And this was the only thing left them. They could either immigrate, which many did, they could either become violent, which few did, only very few, and they had to leave because they were whacked by their own governments, or they could join the mainstream Muslim Brotherhood, they could join local Salafist groups, they could join Islamic charitable societies. Religion was the last resort for them, as it was for young black kids in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. When you don't have a way to redress grievance and fight injustice in civil political mechanisms, your God is your last resort. And of course, God tells all the Abrahamic faiths the same thing. He told Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, pursue justice and only justice. And throughout the Bible, and the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, righteousness and justice are seen to be the two greatest human actions that people should pursue. Of course, faith, love of God is the first thing that God asks people to do in the Abrahamic faith. But then when you say, okay, what do I then do in my daily life? You pursue justice and you act righteously. And this is what the message of Islamists is. And it's very common in all situations. South Africans went to the church to get it. People in Eastern Europe went to the Catholic Church. In Myanmar, people turned to Buddhist monks to fight oppression. So it's a universal thing.
Now, Erdogan, let me bring this back to Syria here in our final minutes. Erdogan and Obama are wrestling over what should be done in Syria. And in a sense, Obama wants to leave Assad where he is and just bomb ISIS. Erdogan said, no, we can't do that. Assad is the source of ISIS. The injustice of this government has created ISIS. It's a natural outcrop. You cannot destroy ISIS without first destroying Assad. Is he right?
I think he's right in a very limited, narrow geographic and time frame. ISIS represents the cumulative failures of the modern Arab societies going back to the 1960s and 70s or even before. But ISIS came out of the Qaeda guys in Iraq, Qaeda in Mesopotamia, who were there with Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who was sent by bin Laden, who came from Saudi Arabia, who came out of indigenous Arab process of citizen discontent, which was widespread in the region. It grew in the radicalization of Arab citizens in their own Arab jails in Egypt and Jordan and Morocco and Syria and Iraq, Saudi Arabia. And these guys got out of jail, went and joined the jihadi movements. So it's all this stuff together with corruption and mismanagement and poverty, and with the added humiliation of foreign attacks and Israeli colonization. So Assad is a small bit of that in the last 3 or 4 years. So I would call Assad a critical issue to resolve in the immediate situation, to be able to allow Syria to move on to a transition to a normal state and take away the chaos that allows ISIS to emerge. A big reason for ISIS's emergence was the environment that the American-British invasion of Iraq provided for them. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda can only work where there's chaos, where there's no governability, where there's no order, there's no hope, there's no normal and decent life for people. They work in Somalia and Mali and Yemen and Afghanistan and Peshawar and Syria and Iraq, and that's the only place they can work, because they don't work in normal, decent societies. People throw them out. These guys are seen to be wacky, dangerous criminals by most people in the Arab world. So there's a whole range of reasons that led us up to ISIS. Now, to get rid of ISIS, you need to address their underlying problems, causes, while also stopping them now, which requires some military action by foreigners and Arabs and Turks and Iranians. But if you just whack them militarily, what you're going to get is a more virulent form. Because the problem of having a coalition led by the US and involving mostly autocratic Arab regimes is the precise combination that gave birth to these movements. American militarism in Saudi Arabia, Soviet militarism in Afghanistan, Arab jails. That combination of Arab autocrats and American militarism is exactly what gave birth to these movements. And if you use that same combination to try to defeat them, you're only going to give rise to a more virulent form. And this is what we've seen. If you go back over the last 40 years or so, the Muslim Brothers became Jama'ah Islamiyya, became Al-Qaeda. Hezbollah and Hamas are different. They're nationalist resistance movements, but they're another form of serious Islamic fighting back. And then you've got the ISIS as the latest, most extreme form. So the trajectory has not been happy. And what it tells you is, if you don't solve the underlying problems, then you're going to get a worse manifestation of people's discontent in the future. And that's why hitting ISIS needs military action in the short term to block them, contain them, and then getting rid of them requires much more serious work by local people as well as foreigners. But the only long-term antidote is to have more decent government, citizens who feel that they're citizens, a little bit more, significantly more social justice and equity in society, which is exactly the demands of people in the uprisings. Social justice, citizenship, constitutional reform, rule of law, no taxation without representation. Anyway, we didn't have bureaucratic people who got their money from oil states or from some other place or foreign support, and the citizens were not taxed and they were not represented, and this is why they're fighting back.
Rami Khouri, thank you so much. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, and good luck with all the great work you're doing.